Welcome to World History. Today we're going to dive into the European Enlightenment. Up until this point, we've been talking about a variety of different governmental systems in Europe, but it's important to understand that these systems didn't just come out of nowhere. A lot of people in Europe were writing and thinking and coming up with new ideas about the best way to run governments and the best way to run societies. And this time period is called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, because people are finally questioning and trying to figure out what the best way to live is. So we're going to look at a number of these people today and talk about their ideas. And so here are your objectives. You're going to describe how the Enlightenment changed the way people thought about knowledge and about life, and identify the ideas of important Enlightenment figures. So, during the Enlightenment, rather than looking to the gods or to tradition, people started gathering together and trying to come up with their own ideas about the world and how it worked, and trying to connect these ideas to then real life situations. This is in many ways a continuation of ideas from the Renaissance, like humanism, and ideals from the Reformation, like individualism and the idea that everyone's interpretation is important. So what you started getting educated people meeting together in gathering places, generally in France, called salons, where these educated people would get together and combine ideas and talk things through and come up with new ideas. And then in something larger called the Republic of Letters, they would write to other people in different areas. And as these ideas bounced around, they became more complete and more fleshed out. And people came up with all these new sort of philosophies about how to best run the world. And so you see all of these educated people together coming up with these ideas that really shape the way that our world works today. One of the important philosophers is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes had lived through the English Civil Wars and the brutality of it. And so his main philosophy ended up being, he started to believe that humans are naturally evil. And if they're not controlled, they'll start a civil war and kill each other. So Hobbes believed that you needed a strong government. He wrote a book called Leviathan, where he basically described the benefits of a strong government. And he argued that the best way to have a strong government was to have absolute rulers who had divine power given to them from kings. And through this, people would be kept safe, and the world would be ordered, and life would not be nasty, brutish, and short. Countering this idea was a guy named the Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu argued that power corrupts. And if you give one person too much power, they're going to end up being corrupt, and things are not going to go well. So he argued that what you needed was to separate powers and give different powers to different people in order to prevent any one person from getting too much power and becoming corrupt. We, of course, see this system in the United States between our three branches of government, each of which has some power over the others in order to stop any one person from getting too powerful. And so a lot of different countries incorporated this in. We'll talk in class about where we see this, but of course in England, the idea that Parliament is the one that provides money for the king is an example of a country using this separation of powers. A French philosopher who used the name Voltaire argued against a whole bunch of different things. He was an advocate of freedom of speech, arguing that if people could freely express ideas, they could come to new understandings and society could be pushed forward. And he was an advocate of using reason to try to solve problems. He was not an advocate of giving people positions because of who their families were. So he was against the whole idea of noble privilege. He was against the church, arguing that they promoted superstition. And then he was against tyrannical government. And so he argued for freedom of speech and ideas, and freedom of thought and religion. A number of Voltaire's ideas, of course, made it into the US Constitution in the form of parts of the Bill of Rights. John Locke was a political philosopher who came up with the idea of the social contract. This is an idea that society is an arrangement between government and the people. He argued that the people give power to their governments, and then the government protects the rights of the people. And this is the responsibility of both of these groups. He also argued that if a government misuses power, the people have the right to overthrow that government. This social contract is incredibly important when we start looking at the different revolutions that we've both already talked about and will talk about. This is, of course, the reason why the American colonists felt like they had the right to overthrow their government. And it also justifies the English Parliament killing and overthrowing Charles because he misused power and did not protect their rights. And so the social contract is this idea that people and governments work together in order to promote freedom. And we've got the anti-Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau argued that humans are naturally good, sort of the opposite of Thomas Hobbes, and that in the perfect state of nature, people will just live together nicely and there won't be any problems. He felt like it was government in general that makes people evil, and therefore we should have more or less no government, or as limited as a government as possible, in order to bring out people's natural goodness. So here we see Rousseau standing in the woods like a hippie, trying to promote that we should all live perfectly happy together in the state of nature. Finally, we've got two guys named Turgot and Smith, and we're not going to go into their philosophies in too much detail, but basically what they wanted was free trade. Mercantilism, as we talked about before, had created all of these different barriers to trade in the form of taxes and tariffs. And both Turgot and Smith argued that in general, if you let markets decide, if you let people buy and sell goods for whatever price they want, eventually they will come to a fair price. And anytime you mess with that, you end up creating unfair prices and creating hardship. And so this philosophy ended up being known as laissez-faire economics, which is a phrase you don't necessarily need to know for this class, but it's the idea that markets and trade should be able to operate freely without opposition from governments. And so hopefully you can describe how the Enlightenment changed the way we thought about knowledge and identify the ideas of the important Enlightenment thinkers. When we come back to this in class, we're going to be looking at these thinkers and trying to pair them with some of the governments and some of the societies we've talked about to see where these ideas work in action.